when we don't see results right away, we give up, right? But it's about like finding those like micro kind of like successes to keep you going. Because in this world of like hitting all of these big numbers and stuff, we forget the responsibility we have as podcasters, which is telling stories.
Podcast Junkies, episode 213. Welcome back. If you are new to the show, this is the one where I speak to some of the most interesting folks in the podcasting world, podosphere, as I like to call it. Last week was no exception. I had a great conversation, essentially what I called a masterclass in monetizing your podcast with Colin Morgan, host of the Daily Grind podcast, episode 212. Make sure you check that out. Been getting a lot of good feedback from that show. This week, I get to speak to Sachit Gupta, host of the Conscious Creators podcast. Sachit and I connected probably a couple of weeks ago, maybe even a month ago now at this point, when I was doing a little bit of research into platforms media, and I reached out and we had an initial conversation, and which turned into a longer one, which turned into an invite to Podcast Junkies. I was fascinated initially by our conversations at what he had done, and I knew it was going to require the full hour to tell his story. It's a fascinating one. It's about how he connected early on in the podcasting space with Andrew Warner, and then subsequently with the likes of Tim Ferriss and Seth Godin. It's really an inspiring story. I invite you to sit back, have your favorite podcasting cocktail handy. But first, I want to thank this week's sponsor, Focusrite and the Scarlett 2i2 third generation sound card. Always have good things to say about the convenience and the quality of this product. Shout out to Dan Hewley from the Focusrite team. They've been a great supporter of the show for a while now. If you need a way to boost your sound, as well as the ability to individually monitor both your microphone and headphone outputs, I can't say enough good things about this sound card. Head on over to podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite. And you'll be taken to the Focusrite for Podcasters page, which they've created specifically to answer a lot of the questions that podcasters have about the gear. As of this recording, the Podcast Movement Evolutions Conference is going on in Los Angeles. I unfortunately couldn't make it out to the conference, so I have a bit of podcasting FOMO, so I'm getting some feedback from some of my friends that are there this week. As we hear back from any new developments or companies, I'll be sure to share that with you in an upcoming episode. This episode is also brought to you by Fullcast, our full-service done-for-you podcast production agency. If you need help starting a show or have some consulting questions related to your existing show, feel free to set up a free chat with me at fullcast.co/chat15. That's chat15. One of the things I really love about this conversation with Sachit is how he discussed the ups and the downs, the things that worked, the things that didn't work, as he was starting to find his way in this digital marketing podcast world, and some of the interesting things that he put into practice, and who he was following at the time, and who he was inspired by as he made his way to building his business. And I love that he's not afraid to share some of the things that are working for him now. It really speaks to his abundance mindset, which I love. Make sure you stay till the end of the episode for this week's retention hashtag. But for now, let's get to creating consciously with Sachit. So Sachit Gupta, host of the Conscious Creators show. Thank you for joining us on Podcast Junkies.
Thank you for having me on, Harry. And I love what you're doing, which is having like people who are always used to being behind the mic and asking other people questions, bringing them on to share their story. I love that mission.
Yeah, thanks for finding the time. And I love, because this is a show about podcasting and it's listened to by a lot of podcasters, a lot of times I love sharing like a little bit of behind the scenes about like even us like trying to figure out settings, because we're using like a lot of different tools, and I like using we're using Crisp now. I've talked a lot on the show with a K, Crisp.ai, and we're also using Squadcast. So sometimes getting all those pieces working together, I think as podcasters we can relate. So maybe we can kick off with you in terms of like your podcasting journey. Did you start as a fan of actual podcasts yourself?
Yeah, and I wanted to quickly mention something on the thing that you talked about before, which is like figuring out the settings and stuff. I think creators and podcasters, like especially newer ones, have this misconception that everything is perfect and you have to wait for perfection to like actually take action. I remember like one of the first interviews I did in person, I had bought these like two really fancy mics, and had like connected them to my laptop through USB. And guess what? Didn't work. Only one worked. And it's funny, I actually shot a time lapse of us doing the interview.
Oh, really?
In the time lapse, it's me and the guest and two mics on the table, but only one of them is working. And we're both kind of like leaning into the same mic. And then 2 weeks later, someone's like, the audio quality was really good. It's like, I think it's important to share these stories because there's this misconception that like everything is perfect, and it's not.
Yeah.
Because it stops creators from creating.
That's exactly right. And I think every single podcaster, I don't know any that do not like their first episode, do not like the sound of their voice. We hear all these things. And I think people who are new to the space think they need to have everything perfect before they record their first episode.
Yeah, exactly. And then back to your original question, which is, I started out as a fan of this podcast called Mixergy back in college, and that was 10 years ago. It's been a long time.
Wow.
But yeah, I remember just looking for entrepreneur stories, found Mixergy, and really just loved his content, and wanted to start something out of college, but didn't end up doing that. Ended up going to the corporate world and spent a year and did not like it. I knew the first day I was going to leave. Left after I literally gave my notice a year and 2 days in.
Wow.
Just to make sure I did a year because it was tied to like relocation stuff and all. I didn't want to deal with that. And then I moved to San Francisco and started emailing all of these companies. And basically my pitch was, which was pioneered by Charlie Hoehn, who wrote the book Recession Proof Graduate. Hey, I want to work with you. I'll work with you for free. Just give me a shot. Emailed hundreds of companies, got a lot of rejections. And one of the people that I had emailed that said yes was Andrew Warner, who had the podcast called Mixergy. And that was the start of the podcast journey.
A couple things in there that are interesting. Where were you relocating from?
I went to college in Pittsburgh, and when I worked at GE Capital, I was in Connecticut.
Okay.
So basically Pittsburgh to Connecticut, and that was the last time I lived in snow.
And then you relocated. What was it that was pulling you to San Francisco?
One, definitely I had family there, and so my brother was there, and he'd been involved in different tech companies, and I think just this like allure of like moving out west, right? Like the tech gold rush and like just the whole story around tech. Like 10 years ago, it was. Remember watching South by Southwest. I remember watching like TechCrunch Disrupt, and sitting in my dorm room in college, and I was like, I want to be a part of that.
Yeah, I remember those were crazy days, pets.com and all these companies, like literally all you needed to have. And that was towards the end of it because I actually left my job I was in JP Morgan Chase, and I left for a non-paying job at a tech startup.
When was that for you?
98.
Oh, wow.
99. Yeah, I saw everything that was happening, and I think just like you, I was just like, I need to be a part of this. It was for like a Latino portal, and so we got in probably like a year or two late because we were trying to get some funding, but it didn't pan out. It was a fantastic learning experience. Some of those magazines that were coming out were really fascinating. I was reading all about like just everything that was happening in that startup space. And, a couple of great companies obviously were born out of that, but it is basically the equivalent of the gold rush. And I think we keep seeing different waves of it. You mentioned at the time you were listening to a lot of podcasts and looking for shows about entrepreneurship. Is that something that is like in your genes, like that entrepreneurial spirit?
I've thought about that a lot recently. And I think, going back to when I was a kid, I remember like first or second grade, growing up in India, two of my uncles, my mom's brothers, one had moved out to the US to start a cabinet company. And one in the 80s, when it was a desert, went to Dubai to start a ball bearing company.
Wow.
And I remember when they would come back, visit us back in India, and just kind of like the stories they would tell and seeing how people responded to them. And I think looking back now in hindsight, that probably like put the seeds in my brain. And obviously like my dad and all my uncles growing up, like they all had their own companies in ball bearings, which is really interesting because I know a lot about it, just kind of like being in that. But I think like now looking back in hindsight, that was probably the genesis of that, and always sort of knew this is what I was going to do.
What's a fun fact about ball bearings that you can share with us?
So I'll share a story actually. So they're sold with these like numbers, like there's all these codes, like 6-digit codes about ball bearings. And literally like they would just pass Excel files with like all these rows of like different codes, like 22603X or whatever. And speaking with my uncles now, they're like, yeah, they still sometimes get nightmares about like remembering the numbers because that's all they did for so long.
Is that common? I'm come from like a Hispanic background. I was born in El Salvador. So in terms of like the culture of like wanting to see your kid go to college, wanting to see your kid become like a professional, whether that's a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. And I know from speaking to a lot of friends who have parents who come from different cultures as well, that that's a lot of pressure. And so you moving into the entrepreneurial space, I don't know if that's common, or maybe the fact that you had uncles and family members who had sort of like been at the frontier with that in terms of your family. What was the feedback from your family when you started going out and doing this entrepreneurial stuff?
Yeah, Indian families wanting their kids to be doctors and lawyers never happens, right? No, that was definitely the case. Actually, when I moved, I started as a computer science major. And I remember like a year in, I was like, this is not what I want to do. I want to switch to information systems. So that was like the first block. And they were like, parents were like, what? But okay, it's similar. And then I actually got into this in my junior year of college. For my senior year, it was this combined program where basically I could get a master's by staying just an extra 6 months. Because in my senior year, I would just take grad level classes. Yeah, like you said, like coming from an Indian background or whatever, getting a bachelor's and master's together, that's like hitting gold, right? So I got into that program, and then I remember 6 months in, or maybe a little more, I was doing interviews for internships because I was gonna have an internship right after college, and it was all with all of these like consulting companies and just banks and stuff. And I remember just looking at that and being like, do I see myself doing that in like 6 years or 10 years? And the answer was no. And another thing I was doing at that point was a friend and I had actually started the TEDx conference at Carnegie Mellon. And so I saw myself spending way more time on that than any like college classes. So I walked into the dean's office and I was like, I'm going to drop out of the master's. And then I called my parents. I think I called them after, from what I remember. And they were like,
I was going to ask you what the order of that was, because you were probably nervous about both aspects of it.
But I mean, I think they were just like, okay, well, he's going to keep doing these things.
Yeah.
And I think that's just kind of in the story, like getting a corporate job and quitting after a year and going to, I remember calling my parents. I was like, I quit my job and I could do the smart thing and get another job. Or I could, or I told them, like, I could get another job, or I want to go travel and I have some savings. I was like, so I'm going to do the smart thing. And I booked a one-way ticket to Bangkok. And they weren't happy about that.
How long were you there?
I went to Bangkok for about a month, and then I went to Bali. That's also another crazy story. I was in Bali. I had travel insurance when I was in Bangkok and didn't use it. So I was like, I don't really need this. And I went to Bali, didn't have that. And about 10 days in, dislocated my shoulder. No. And that was a crazy experience, just being in a country where you don't know anyone and you have to go to the hospital and make sure they don't overcharge you. And
what's the short story or the quick story on how you dislocated your shoulder?
We were basically going from one town to another on a bike, and someone else was driving it. I was sitting on the back, and it's kind of like making a turn, and it slipped, and I fell. And I mean, I had helmets and everything, but just everything was good. But I felt at a weird angle, and boom.
Was that your first time in that part of the world, like in Bangkok and Bali, like and seeing like that culture? And was it anything of a culture shock, or what was your first experience or your first thoughts when you landed there and you started spending some time there?
Yeah, definitely a culture shock, because I'm pretty sure it was my first time visiting there. I'd been to like on trips to like Hong Kong and stuff with my parents, and I guess one thing that was different was growing up. I'm just remembering this now. It's interesting. Because my mom and one of my uncles had gone to this boarding school in India where they had met this family from Thailand, and they became really close. So their kids would visit us in India all the time growing up.
Oh, wow.
So I just sort of learned and absorbed culture from them probably. So it wasn't as much of a culture shock because we knew someone there.
Yeah, in 2004, I went to Thailand for the first time because I had met a friend that I had met in Amsterdam years before. We kept in touch, and this is like through email back, and there's no Facebook back then. It was just strictly emails. He told me that he had his parents had a house in Koh Samui, and he said, come visit. So I was like, yeah, sure. So I basically went. It took me 26 hours to get there from New York at the time. And I took a plane from New York to Frankfurt, I think it was, and then from Frankfurt to Singapore. And from Singapore, I took a flight to Suratani, which is like a coastal city. And then I took a ferry for like an hour to Koh Samui. And I remember being on that ferry and thinking, if this ferry sinks, like nobody in the world knows where I am.
Yeah, I remember doing that exact trip, I think in reverse, going from Koh Samui back to Bangkok, the ferry and everything.
But it was the first time I really felt like I was like in a completely different culture, because normally, like, if I'm in a culture where it's like even Italian or Spanish or Portuguese, because I speak the language, I can kind of relate. But there I was just like, I don't know a thing you're saying. And even the colors and the food and everything. It was just we were riding like mopeds with like no shirt on around town, going to visit like the temples. It was a definitely eye-opening experience. So I had a lot of fun when I was there. So I'm always asking like how much of a shock. But I think for you, since you had that interaction with that family, that must have been pretty special.
One thing I would add to that is also like just growing up in India and moving to the US. The more you do it, the more you get used to it. And I think that actually translates a lot to the work that I do, because when you move from one place to another, right, it questions a lot of assumptions that you have. Like I remember, I think this was either when we were visiting the US before, when I moved to the US, I remember going to McDonald's and ordered food, and then they gave us the cup for the drink. And they give us the cup and it's empty. I'm like, wait, where's my drink? And they're like, oh, you can just go. I'm like, wait. And they're like, yeah, it's free refills. And I'm like, wait, free refills? If you did that in Asia, like one family would show up with like one cup for everyone. And so I think like it's when you move around that much, you learn to just question assumptions, because really like what people think are rules is just sort of made up by a human.
Yes, exactly. It sounds like your parents did a little bit of traveling, so you got a lot of cultural experiences through them as well.
Yeah, we used to, because my uncle had moved to the US. This is really funny now you think about it. Now that I think about it or think back about it, he moved to Omaha. So we did a lot of summer trips to the US from India, but they were all to Omaha. And so my idea of what America was for a long time, until I put two and two together, it was like, is this Omaha? Like it's all farms and stuff.
Wow.
Until I was like, wait, I'm watching these TV shows. There's other parts of the U.S.
It's so funny because when I talk to people who come from other countries, their first impression of the U.S. is Baywatch.
Yep.
And they're like, oh, like everyone looks like they're on Baywatch, and then they get here and they arrive in places like Omaha, and they're like, wait, what happened? Like, where's like David Hasselhoff and where's Pamela Anderson?
Yeah.
And well, you actually had the reverse effect, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, a lot of time in Omaha.
So when you got to San Francisco and you started, putting the feelers out for who you wanted to work with, and then you had a call back from Andrew Warner. He's got a very popular podcast called Mixergy. Can you talk just at a high level what that experience was like and what you learned from him?
Yeah, and with that I can go into specifics. It was basically like I remember I sent him an email and I was like, hey, work for you for free or whatever. And I remember we did a call, and like he was like, these are really great ideas and my company isn't ready to hire you. And I'd gotten all of these no's, and I'm like, this is probably the politest rejection someone's given me. And so a few months later, he was actually moving to San Francisco from DC, and he sent me a message being like, hey, like, do you want to meet up? And so we met up. We didn't really talk work, and he was working out of this place or offices called Regis. And they had this thing called a business lounge membership, which was I'd gotten for free through like credit card deals.
Yeah.
So I was like, like being close to someone is important. So I just started like kind of like working from Regis. I didn't really have clients. I was applying for jobs, but it looked like I was. And I remember one day he was putting together this project, and he's like, hey, do you want to help me for this? It ended up being 2 hours, and I was like, I'll do it for free, whatever. And he's like, no, I want to pay you. So he paid me $200.
Yeah.
I think it was like $100 an hour, which looking back, I just made up that rate when you asked me to have something. And that was the start of our relationship. And we can kind of like go into specifics of what I did or whatever you want to talk about. But yeah, that was the start, and he's still a client 8 years later.
That's an amazing story. Yeah. So to the extent that you want to go into specifics, I think it'll be helpful. But like, what type of stuff did you start working on? Because 8 years is a long time. And obviously anyone who's familiar with his show has seen how his show has grown. And it already had some traction because you had found the show, and he's one of the early pioneers in podcasting. So I'm wondering what types of stuff you worked on, because I think it would be pretty interesting for the listener.
Yeah, so it started off, and I think one of the biggest misconceptions people have is like when they look at a podcaster, they're like, the podcast is the only thing that they do, right? But the best people use it as a channel for like a lot of other stuff. Totally. So with Andrew, like he had courses and had Mixergy Premium, and really like for the first year, my role was, and we didn't even have a title, and later on we made it called like Director of Special Projects, which I got from what Charlie Hohen did with Tim Ferriss. And it was just doing whatever he wanted me to do. So like I'll help build a website for one of his courses, TrueMind. at some point it was like, hey, like trying to like systemize this company. So can you help work with people to create SOPs? That was probably the least favorite thing that I did because I realized like that's not how my brain works. And then at some point I remember looking at sponsorships and seeing that the sponsor that Andrew talked about in the interview and the one in the show notes didn't match. And so I sent Andrew an email being like, hey, just an FYI, you might want to fix this. And I got a sense from his reply that he didn't want to deal with sponsorship. And because I had proven myself on like other stuff, I was like, hey, can I take a crack at this? Don't pay me up front, give me a percentage and we'll figure it out. And he's like, sure, because he didn't want to keep dealing with it. And I think like talking to him afterwards, realized like he was expecting maybe a 20-30% improvement. So what I did was I talked to first like a few of his friends, like Sam Parr, who runs The Hustle, to just kind of like think about how to do sponsorship. I remember emailing Pat Flynn, and Pat Flynn is so generous. He was like, oh, you worked with Andrew, anything for Andrew, and like got on the call with me, shared whatever he was doing. And I saw like the sponsorships were being sold by a CPM. But because I came from a marketing background, I'm like, wait, but if it leads to more ROI, why are we selling on a CPM? So the first sponsor we talked to, TopTal, I was just like, hey, like from a marketing perspective, what are you guys' like acquisition costs? And then we we're like, yeah, like so like based on sort of what the acquisition cost is, do you think they'll give you like 5 or 6 customers a month? And they were like, yeah, like that seems very likely. I'm like, okay, so let's just multiply that and that number. Like, does this seem fair for like a month of sponsorship? And they were like, yeah. So that's how I sold my first one. In that conversation, what I did, I doubled the rates.
Wow.
Just because we went from like CPM to just like ROI based.
Yeah.
And to their credit, like TopTal has been an amazing company to work with. Andrew, because of the audience of Mixergy, obviously like we delivered. And that was the first sponsor I signed for Mixergy, and they are still a sponsor.
I'm sure they appreciate the fact that they started working with you guys early.
Yeah, and anything like really shifting the conversation from CPM to ROI, it just changes that dynamic because we're not like tied to like, hey, these many episodes are this. It's like, what do we do to give you an ROI? And like if like now like if something doesn't work, we'll add in more stuff. So like last year we started sending emails to the Mixergy list as a test to see if that would move the needle for a sponsor, and it did. And now we built it into the plan. So I think it's just really about experimenting with other stuff besides the podcast to make sure you deliver on ROI.
So then as you started working with Andrew, did you start to just grow that as much as you could? And then was there a transition when you decided that it might make sense for you to start working with other podcasters?
Yeah. So when I started working with Andrew, I was still sort of like a consultant. And I think anyone who's done consulting or whatever has been through that phase. Like when they start, they're doing so many different things, right? So like I remember there was a point in 2015 where I was managing sponsorships for Mixergy. I was building websites for people. I was working with this energy drink brand in India where I was running like their Facebook ads and like their whole funnel and stuff. It's like, this is too crazy. Like I can't manage all of it. And it was just me, like one person with like maybe a few contractors in some places for like the website stuff.
The energy drinks weren't helping you?
They were in India, so I didn't even have them. Like whenever my cousin who ran that like would visit the US, I'm like, bring some for me because they're really good. So around like August 2015, I'm like, I'm going to like niche down and just pick podcasts. And so that's when I made a decision. Okay, like these are the people I would like working with, and this is just what's going to be my focus.
And then did you start to get introduced to other podcasters through the relationship with Andrew? And then was there a moment when it made sense for you to start doing your own thing?
Yeah. So and this is a crazy story where like, so I made that decision to like start focusing on podcasts, and I came back to San Francisco, and I started like just sending emails to friends. And one of the friends I emailed was Ned Dwyer, who used to run this company called Elto. And he was like, hey, well, have you worked with Tim Ferriss? And I can't go into the specifics of what we did, but I was like, no, but like that would be like the dream client. And hopefully I can work with him in like 1 to 2 years.
And what year
right?
was
like,
this then? So just so people have some context.
Yeah, this is August of 2015,
okay.
August or September. And so Ned was like, well, what's the angle? I'd love to make an intro. And so I told, and I'd just like done this thing with Mixergy where basically in one day we sold 70,000 in sponsorships. And that was more than Andrew had done like the year before.
Yeah.
So it was just insane. We were like, what just happened, right? So I'd recorded a case study with Andrew and I sent it to Ned, and he was like, okay, this actually is good. I'll make the intro. And I remember going, Ned, I sent him an email. I'm like, but like just wait for a little bit because I wanted to make sure I'm ready for it, right? It's like one shot. And what happened, interestingly, was someone else had told Tim's team about me. And I later found out it was through Charlie Hohen.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason for that was, and quick tangent because I think it's important. So Charlie wrote Recession Proof Graduate while I was in college about how he worked with Ramit Sethi and all. And I remember emailing him, just asking him questions. And then I used his book to work with Andrew, and I always kept him updated on what I was doing. Because I think like people miss that like the creators that you are passionate about, they actually like hearing stories of people using their stuff.
That's a good
point.
Build
a relationship, just like send an email being like, hey, I read your book and this is what I use. Like I think if this is the only thing people get away from this, they'll just build a much better relationship with creators, and creators will feel better, right?
Yeah, it's basically like we all stand on the shoulders of giants, right? And so like we learn from people that have gone before us, and I think giving them credit for how they've either inspired us or something we've used. I think sometimes as creators we put stuff out there and we're like, is anyone using my stuff? Does it resonate with anyone? Is anyone getting value from this? And to your point, I think not enough people go back to these creators and say, hey, I read your book, or hey, I listened to your podcast, or hey, I did your program and it worked. So
yeah, I'm sure you feel that. I'm curious, like if people are listening to this and they actually learned something. Feel free to email both of us, because I respond to most emails. Just especially if someone's like, oh, I listened to you on this podcast, right? So I just kept Charlie updated, and I think what happened was Charlie had done really well with Tim, and I think Tim's team was looking for someone like him, and they emailed Charlie and they were like, hey, who do you recommend? And he recommended me. So literally about a month from when I had emailed Ned, I think timeline isn't completely exact, but about a month, I wake up to an email in my inbox and it says, inquiry from Tim Ferriss. It's like, what is happening? This is insane.
That's awesome.
And so we did a call, and then we met in person, and obviously went through the process, and he ended up becoming a client a month or two after I decided to focus on podcasting, and just had this incredible experience working with him and helping him grow his audience and podcast with Facebook ads and stuff. And yeah, it's a huge privilege to like have that experience.
Can you talk a little bit, not the specifics, but can you talk a little bit about what you learned from someone like Tim? Because I think we see it from the exterior. A lot of people know, and obviously people who have read his books know the discipline that he puts in. But I think, we got a peek at it from learning from Charlie, and I'm familiar with his story as well. But since you had the opportunity to work with him, what are some takeaways that you learned from how he runs his business or how he lives his day to day that were valuable for you and that you carry forward to this day?
Yeah. So I'll actually translate, because I also worked with Andrew, and then working with Tim led to working with Seth Godin. So I'll kind of combine them all, so it's not just one person, and just lessons. I think the first lesson was sort of what we started with, which is I went in expecting with everyone things to be completely perfect, right? And the thing that I've now realized, it's never like that, right? Like if you look at Pat Flynn or Jordan Harbinger, all creators, we expect, looking from outside, that everything's great. It's not, right? Like your company, people are like, oh, podcast junkies, everything is running smoothly. You're like, no, it's not. There's always fires. And I think it's important to say this out loud, because a lot of people don't start because they wait for perfect.
Exactly.
But that's never going to happen, because even the people that you idolize, they're not there yet.
Yeah.
So that was one. I think another thing was just, I believe the standards and goals that you set for yourself are really important. And I think working with Tim and seeing, and I think you can see this from the outside too, is learning a different standard to operate on.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. I think people know the reach he has and the audience he's built. And I remember initially when I talked to their team, I was like, what's the goal? And they're like, we want to grow this. And so someone who's already there, they're they still want to grow, they still want to reach more people, right? And it just shows you, they're like, oh, maybe I'm thinking too small. Maybe I need to think bigger.
Interesting.
So that was an interesting lesson. And I think one lesson, just sort of observing him work, which I really appreciate, is what I realized is people who are at the top, who are the best, they know what they're good at. And for everything else, they find the best people. I'm not saying I was the best, but they find people who are good at what they do, and then they give them the room to do it. And I think sometimes what happens is when you're a creator and you're starting to grow, as you start giving things away, you either don't hire the best, and I've made that mistake, or you hire people and then you don't give them the freedom. And I've also made that mistake, right? So just kind of seeing that was really interesting, because the best people will find other best people and trust them.
And it's also room to make some mistakes at times. To grow and to also experiment, I think, is really important as well.
Yeah, and I think for example, if you're hiring someone who's a marketer for your company, if they're not making any mistakes, that actually I think means they're scared to experiment.
That's a good point.
Because of the conditions you've set.
Great point.
Right? So like, because in marketing, like as we know, not everything works. And you want to have that room for people to do that.
Anything else in terms of what you learned from working with folks of that caliber?
I think this is probably a general life lesson, and it's going to sound really simple, but I think we're in this weird world where like everyone's trying to do Facebook ads and funnels, and like you go on LinkedIn and you get all these spammy messages. Again, I've made those mistakes too, right? Like spammy emails and stuff. If I look back, all these clients that I worked with, all of this stuff came through relationships, right? Like starting my own podcast now, like I've been lucky enough to like start with a really good group of guests just from the start. None of that was from Facebook ads. All of just this, that was spending the time over like the last 5-10 years building relationships. And I think it's seeing like people, one of the things I saw was like how people built relationships and just thought long term. Like one story for me for working with Andrew was, I remember this is really early on, like probably the first 3 months of working with him, because I used to work in the office with him. I remember he was doing an interview and a founder came on, and Andrew, I think, like was like, I don't know if this is a good fit for Mixergy because there's like revenue numbers that Mixergy has as a qualifier. And he was like, what do you want to see? And it was like, here's my PayPal, here's whatever you need. And no, like, you need to sign an NDA or whatever, right? Because that was the trust Andrew had built with his audience, with people. And the value he put on that. Because you can build a reputation, and it takes a long time, and in 5 minutes you can ruin it.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's a quote from Warren Buffett, actually.
Yep.
So just seeing how they all valued the relationships, I think that was really key.
Was this around the time that you basically formalized your own production company?
I didn't even think about it as a production company. I was just sort of really like more of a solo consultant.
Okay.
Had about 3 to 5 clients at a time because I didn't really want to grow it beyond that.
Yeah.
Now I realize like I'm just not the systems guy and have to partner with people who do that, which you guys do really well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wouldn't even think about it as a production company. It was just me finding people I was inspired by, finding messages that I was inspired by, and helping take that to more people. Like that was the thesis.
So you're working with some of the top podcasters in the industry. When did the light bulb go off for you that this is something that you wanted to do and you now wanted to get behind the mic?
It was definitely a really hard journey for that. I remember 2016, like reaching a point where I was working with all of them, right? And a lot of this I've actually figured out in the last year. The story that I actually had driven a lot of that was I didn't believe my skill set or creative stuff or marketing was good enough because every creator faces the good enough story. Yeah. So the only way I could prove that wrong was working with the best. And then I got it and I was like, wait, what do I do next? Like, what's next? Right? Because it's really easy to like just put another person. And I did that. I'm like, oh, wait. Okay, now like, is the next target Richard Branson? You have to do marketing
exactly.
for him to tell me if I'm good, right? Like, or like these big brands. I'm like, this is never going to end. And lastly, it was more of a personal journey of figuring out sort of like these motivations and realizing like, yeah, when I was a kid, I actually used to like love painting, and I stopped because I didn't think my paintings were good. And so that story had always been like, always there. And I was like, as soon as I realized it was more related to fear, I'm like, I have to like solve this. So that was one thing. And the second thing was, realizing that I have this like really unique perspective where I've been on the business side with like sponsorships and growth and stuff, but also have like an interest in the creative stuff with art and all. And how do you merge those stories, right? Because a lot of creators think it's separate. Like business people know something they don't, and business people think creators don't know something they don't. And I want to merge those stories. And I didn't see anyone was doing that. So I was like, all right, I'm going to create that. So like that's been actually the most fun thing is, for example, having someone like Sahil Lavingia who started Gumroad, having a conversation with him where we're talking about art and just like the focal point in paintings and all of these different things, and then switching over to like the WeWork S1 and him wanting to build $1 billion company. Like, how do you merge those worlds?
So when did you start to get the thoughts together of what the show would be, what the name would be, and who you wanted to start having early on as guests? I
decided probably towards the end of October. So it's all come together really fast.
Recently.
I remember I went to an event in September, a business conference, and literally I was like, yep, I'm going to build an agency that represents podcasters and be the guy behind the scenes for the next 5-10 years. And 2 months later, it's like, nope, actually it's switching. So I met a friend and she produces a podcast for a different company and we both wanted to start one. We're like, let's do like an accountability thing where you gonna work here on yours, I'll work on mine, and we'll do it together.
Mm-hmm.
And then literally like a month and a half later, we launched, or maybe a little more time. But for guests, and I think sharing this, I realized my podcast experience and expertise, like from like the last 10 years, makes my experience not a typical experience. So like if you're starting a podcast, do not expect this to happen, right?
Results may differ.
Yeah, because I think like one of the big things was like, for example, just reaching out to the podcast clients I worked with, being like, hey, how do you do this part? And again, because I had that relationship, they're like, here's our thing, right? Like with Mixergy, I mean, like, Andrew, like, how do you manage the booking thing? They're like, here's our booking process that he's built over like a long time. Already knew growth, already had relationships with guests. So really following my own curiosity and just people I already knew.
So one of the first guests you had on was Phil Towle. Is that pronounced that?
Phil Tewell.
Phil Tewell. Who's worked with Metallica. And so, is there a reason why you decided to kick off with that specific conversation?
Yeah, I call Phil the sensei amongst senseis. Yeah, so actually, the conference that I mentioned, and this is again, it's been just all of these crazy things connecting. I was at this conference and I met someone towards the end, which by chance, who introduced me to a friend of his because I told him I was looking for scraping advice, and he just kind of remembered and was like, "Here, talk to my friend." We didn't really talk about work, and we both were like, I got on a call with his friend Eric. We're like, we think really similarly. Like, do you know other people like that? He's like, nope. And so the next day, he sends me an email being like, hey, want to meet my performance coach? Because he was working with Phil. And just looking at Phil's background, I was like, sure, right? And I actually remember this. I went to Phil's website because in our world of like, especially the IM marketing world, there's a lot of like performance coaches, right? Like they haven't done anything. I remember going to Phil's website and I started looking at the case studies, and I didn't know who the first two were. So there was this company, which now I realize is a public company. Second one was Rascal Flatts, and I was like, I don't know what this is.
Oh, the singer, yeah.
And the third one was Metallica. I was like, oh, okay, this is real. So I got on a call with Phil, and this is probably the second or third week of September. And he basically goes, and I told him, like, yeah, like I'm work with creators behind the scenes or whatever. He goes, I don't think you're the behind the scenes guy. I think you're more of a front man.
Oh.
And like I did coaching with him, and that was actually one of the genesis of me now switching to like being behind the mic.
Yeah.
And so when that happened, I was like, he has to be the first guest. Like, there's no question.
How do you prepare for the interviews? And so talk a little bit about what you might do either from prep work or how does the conversation flow go in terms of what you have in mind?
And again, I think there's a lot of different ways to do this. I know podcasters who don't do any prep versus like Mixergy, where there's a whole prep team that does a pre-interview with every guest, and like it's very highly produced in that sense. I'm gonna give away this hack that I figured out. So what I've done, and I didn't realize how well this worked until I did it in a couple of interviews. And before I was like, should I keep this a secret? But I'm like, no, I'll give this
abundance mindset.
Yeah, exactly. So what I do is, especially with guests that I know, I find someone close to them, right? Like who's worked with them, and I go to them and I'm like, okay, I ask them a few questions. I'm like, you've probably heard a lot of their podcasts, especially if they're on the person's team. What are things that they're always asked about, that they always talk about? Because I'm like, I'm not going to ask that question, right? Because otherwise people just go into the same stuff. And then I ask them, okay, what are things that they should be asked about that they're not asked about? So that gives me topics that they haven't gone into, but they want to talk about. And the third one, which is the most important one, which is, you've known them for so long, what are you curious about? Because if someone already knows them and has already had conversations and they come up with something, it's like really deep stuff, right? Because it's based on that relationship. So those give me like four, like usually I like have like four themes and a few questions. And then I accidentally did this in an interview recently and it worked really well. So I'm going to do it in every interview. I basically go, and I think actually Tim Ferriss has done that in a lot of interviews. When I ask the question, I'm going, so I actually spoke with someone who's really close to you. I was told to ask you this question. Because then they're like, wait, who did you talk to?
Exactly.
And what's the question? And I don't tell them that, right? But I think like what I'm really trying to do is like capture stories that they haven't told everywhere else. And this sort of like is a small hack to get to that. Because then I'll start with I remember I did this with a friend and he was like, the next day he was like, hey, so all those questions that we kind of came up with, did you end up using any of them? And I was like, I started with them.
Yeah.
Because it just completely changed the interview.
Yeah. And it shows, I think, for people that have been on a lot of shows, it really makes them realize that this is not going to be your typical interview. And it's sort of, they appreciate when you've done the research. They appreciate when you bring up something or you've listened to something or researched their content, because you can hear it in what they say. They're like, oh, I can see you've done your research, or, oh, no one's ever asked me that. I mean, every podcaster wants that. Oh, no one's ever asked me that question before.
Yeah. Or like, that's a great question, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I remember when I'll share 2 stories on that. I remember when I interviewed James Altucher, who's done many podcasts and is a host himself.
Yeah.
I asked a question. I was like, that's a great question. That's a great question. And in the middle, at some point, he goes, that's a really great question. I keep saying that, but these are all really good questions. And I was like, I'm doing something right. And that's one. And the second one is I interviewed a company we were talking about right before this, Vlad, who's the CEO of Webflow.
Yeah.
And he actually, if you go on his Twitter, there's this like thread where he talks about his journey. So he's like 2004 had the idea for Webflow, 2006 graduate, like just kind of like how it took him 15 years to get to where he is now, where they raised all this money. What I did was I went into it, started reading all the responses. And in some of the responses, he actually shared screenshots from, I think, a paper that he wrote in college about like the idea from Webflow.
Wow.
So I think I literally started the interview or very 5 minutes in. I was like, so I found this paper that you wrote and you said this, and I read like what he wrote, right? Because I've like have those in my notes. And yeah, I think it just showed a different level of prep. And I think it makes the guests feel that their time is being valued too.
Totally. Where does that come from? Because what I've noticed in our conversation, a common thread is you have a way of thinking of ideas that are outside the box. You don't settle for like normal, and you're always looking to improve yourself. So like, where does that drive come for you?
I think it's probably an immigrant mindset, right? Like growing up in India, country of like billion people, and most people, and I knew very early on that I was going to come to the US, but if you don't, especially if you're in like computer science or the sciences, there's this one test that everyone takes, like across the country for IIT, which is like the best university in India, and very few people get in. So this story of like, oh, not everyone's going to make it, and the effort that you put in is what's going to translate to results. So just working harder than like most people, and then moving to the US, like the story of like, I made it, right? Like not a lot of people are able to do this. So there's a responsibility that comes with it. And if you're doing something, you have to prepare. Like for me, trying to do something where I haven't prepared is so unnatural because that's what I'm just used to. But what I realize now is the preparation that I do in certain things goes beyond what most people would think. Like I remember when I first started working with Andrew, I remember reading this quote from Patio 11, who's like very well known on Hacker News, or a statement where like, if you're working with a client, know their business better than them. I was like, okay.
That's good.
So I started working with Andrew, and I think for the first year had a search set up, which was Andrew Warner or Mixergy. I wasn't doing marketing, but any tweet or anything that someone publicly said about Mixergy or to Andrew, I was reading that. So I would sometimes, like when we were working there, to go to the office and be like, hey, that was a really cool thing that you told that person. And he's like, who the fuck are you, right? Like, probably he's like, why are you reading all of this?
Yeah, stalking
but
me.
I think it's just like, sorry?
Cyber stalking me.
Yeah, but I think it's just this idea of like being really prepared. And for me, like when I see people aren't prepared, I'm like, that's one thing that's under your control. How much time you spend for this, how much research you do, how many books you read.
Yeah.
And I think if we have this opportunity, you can see behind me, there's all these books. Like if you have this opportunity and time to work on this stuff, why not give it 100%?
It's like having this natural curiosity and always looking to improve yourself and learn. There's so much. You also have to be a good like collator of content, because there's so much now. You have to be able to separate the shitty advice from like something that can actually help you, because everyone now has advice on how you can grow. Everyone now has marketing advice. And so you got to be really selective.
I just got into online business, and 6 months later, here's my course on how to start an online business. And I now feel I think like there should be like a time limit. Like you have to be doing it for like, and I'm not completely sure if I agree with what I'm saying, But I think there's so many people now that are selling advice who don't have experience, and I think there should be some sort of limit or some qualifier. Because like one of the things I now look for in terms of like who I'm listening to is like just how long have they been doing this, and do they actually have like demonstrated results?
So what's been the experience so far for you in recording and publishing these episodes and these interviews? What have you, I mean, I know it's not like a ton so far, but what have you learned just from even starting episode 0 and what you're learning as you proceed with the show?
Yeah, I think I should have like very clear lessons already that I think will be very important for newer podcasters. So like one was this idea that I remember I was recording a podcast with a friend and he was like, what does conscious creators mean? I was like, crap, I hadn't thought of that. And what I've realized about this now is when you're creating something, all of us expect to have all the answers before.
Yeah.
And then we start creating. What I'm now learning is you actually have to start and then you start finding the answers, right? So like for me, what conscious creators means has evolved as I do more interviews because I learned something from James Altucher and something from this other person. Like, oh, like that's actually like from their journey, this is what is a principle that what the conscious creator is. So that's probably the first one. I think the second one was this idea around expectations. I didn't realize until I spoke actually with Charlie Owen and I said something. I'm like, yeah, like working with the people that we worked with, we had really warped expectations. And he was like, yeah. And I was like, oh, someone else now gets it.
Yeah.
Right? Because when you're working with people at the top, and I think there was a part of me that was like, I want to take this show to number 1. And that's not a good expectation to have when you're starting something new. We did hit the charts afterwards, but that was just because of marketing stuff that I had learned over the long time, which again, very atypical. But just idea of like changing expectations, and instead of like trying to hit big numbers, just seeing one like what was the guest experience. So like when guests started saying the questions are really good, and then when I got feedback on like individual episodes from people I knew, they were like, oh yeah, I like how you asked this question. I'm like, okay, I'm on the right track, and I want to do this for a long time because I think a lot of times when we don't see results right away, we give up, right? But it's about like finding those like micro kind of like successes to keep you going, because in this world of like hitting all of these big numbers and stuff, we forget the responsibility we have as podcasters, which is telling stories. And sometimes one story, if it changes one person's life, it's important. It doesn't have to, not everything has to reach thousands or millions of people.
You had Catherine Lavery on.
Catherine Lavery on.
We took the foundation course. This is like 4 years ago now, and so and we met briefly at a meetup. So I'm looking forward to hearing that. I'm happy with the success that she's had. But I think it's Dane. I forgot his name now. Dane.
Dane Maxwell and Andy.
Yeah. The foundation. I took that. I joined the foundation. This is one of my early I was trying everything digital marketing in the beginning, and I tried the foundation. It was pretty helpful. So I'm looking forward.
And that's another lesson in general, not just about podcasting.
Yeah.
You'll see a lot of people break through in podcasting, right? Like my show, because of the marketing stuff that we did, like it hit number 25 on the charts across all US, which is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what people don't see is the 10 years I spent learning marketing and doing stuff for other people. In your case, like people will see your success. They don't see all like, I don't know how successful the foundation was for you, but like all the other stuff that you've tried.
Yeah.
Right. And I think like anyone kind of like is going like this, like I'm making my hand go up and do the right. They have this like tail end of like just doing the work before. Because people just expect success right away. And it can happen, but you also just have to put in the time. You have to like put in the apprenticeship and just learn stuff.
Who would you say in your family has been most surprised by the success you've had?
Me.
That's a good one.
No, I don't know actually who, but I've been surprised with like what's just happened in the last 6 months.
Yeah. Is there a relationship with a mentor, maybe someone you haven't mentioned, that's been important for you as well?
I think definitely Phil kind of like showing me that switch. Andrew for sure, right? Like I got into podcasting and he gave me a shot, and like that's what led to it. One of my mentors, Rajesh Sethi, who's written a lot of books and is an advisor to a bunch of companies like Mind Valley. And I'm trying to distill a principle down, and actually I think the principle would be this: is finding people who are in their like 40s or 50s who are way ahead of the game, and going to them for advice, because they give such a different perspective, right? Like I remember one of my another favorite podcasts, like Chris Lockhead, Follow Your Different, being on a call with him, and him sharing a story about how, like, and I can't share that story actually, but just a story about how, because of the reputation he's built, like how things happen with him, right? And him talking about like how important that reputation is, and just learning from them.
Yeah, I think too many people are afraid to ask for help, and there's a lot of folks that have had a lot of success in their business and in their careers, and now they're ready to give back. And I think they're just eager to work with people who want to learn from them. And I think they really see it as a badge of honor to be asked to mentor. And so I think there's probably tons of people out there who have run successful businesses and had a lot of success, and are ready to sort of pass the torch on to a younger generation.
Yeah, and I think here's like 3 tactical things that people can do, that I've done that have helped me accelerate. One is, if you're listening to a podcast or reading a book and you like what the person says, send them a thank you.
Oh yeah.
Right? Like, because people don't get those. Second is, not only send them a thank you, ask them a question, but then actually implement what they told you and let them know in 2 weeks. Because I think like the number of people that reach out and say thank you is super small.
Yeah.
The number of people actually like ask you for advice and then do it is way smaller. Right? And I think like people don't do that anymore. And the third one is, and I remember doing this when I first moved to California, I didn't have money to pay for conferences and stuff. So what I would just do is volunteer for conferences. So if you're in an industry where everyone's getting together and you don't have money to pay for it, like podcast movement or whatever, just email them and be like, hey, can I just come and help and volunteer?
Oh yeah.
Because no one does that again.
Very, very, very good information, and I'm sure people are taking copious notes on this interview. A couple of questions as we wrap up. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
It's still evolving, but how I want to play in the podcasting game. And I think like, I'm sure you've had these conversations where I think there's a lot of people out there who think like podcasts are maturing, right? And I remember having a conversation with last week I got, which another one of those like crazy instances, like got invited to like Sundance Movie Festival. And I remember having a conversation with someone who was a creative director at a really big company. And I was like, yeah, like people are saying like podcasts are maturing. And he goes, yeah, if a 4-year-old baby is mature. And it's just like so early days where I think people think that everyone has the answers. They don't. Most people are still experimenting, and what's going to be pioneered in the next 5-10 years is going to be insane. So just sort of like, once I realized that, my mindset shifted from, oh wait, other people have the answers, I need to figure out what they know, to, oh, this is early days, and there's room to experiment, there's room to try new things, and no one knows what this is going to look like in like 5 years. People have a hypothesis, but it's early days.
Yeah, and in a ways, it's similar to like, what you were seeing when you came out to San Francisco, like the gold rush of the .com and what would later become all these Web 2.0 companies. A lot of that is happening, even though podcasting has been around since 2005, 2006, I think the maturity level and the amount of money that's coming in have it positioned to just even have like even another hockey stick in terms of bump and growth.
Yeah, and I think like there's different like modalities, like people are now building brands around podcasting and then building a whole ecosystem. I think that's something I'm excited about. And I think just innovating on the product, right? Like, I've seen people that are building apps for products that are way more integrated. So for example, when you're listening to a podcast and someone mentions an ad, why isn't there a pop-up that you just click and go to the advertiser? Right? Like stuff like that. And I think there's going to be social networks around podcasting, so you can connect with people. One of them is actually Listen. They did really well on Product Hunt when they initially launched. Yeah, I think it's just early days still.
What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think recently it's probably a lot of people think like, and I think this actually applies to a lot of creators and podcasters, that I'm super extroverted. And a lot of podcasters I know are super introverted. So they love being behind the mic, but when they're at an event, they're like, leave me alone, kind of thing. So that's
and people think they're super extroverted because they hear them talking all the time, so they just naturally want to come up and like socialize with them, but it's usually the opposite. Well, Sachit, thank you for making the time. This was a really fascinating conversation. I think the listener learned a lot about what's happening in the podcasting space, and your story is super inspirational. So I'm really happy that we got a chance to connect, and I appreciate you taking the time and sharing your story with my audience.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. And if you're still listening, definitely let us know what you thought. Like if you email, we'll respond.
What's the best way for people to connect with you and to find the show?
The URL is just creators.show, or if you are on the podcast apps, just search Conscious Creators, which I realized afterwards, conscious is a really hard word to spell. Because I saw a few friends do it and I was like, I messed that one up. I have to probably do some SEO stuff or change the name. And my email is just my first and last name at gmail.com. Reach out and I'll respond.
Okay. Well, thanks for taking the time, and I appreciate you sharing your story.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So thanks again to Sachit for coming on the show. I really love his story of how he got started. When you think about all the things that he did in the beginning, how resourceful he was, and how he knew that his perceived career trajectory was not where he was going to end up, because he was being called to something bigger and something better, and pulled out west like a lot of folks are in the digital marketing and the tech world, and just realizing, he needed to add value early on, a lot of value, in order for him to get noticed. And it's just one of the reasons why I really, really love his story. And I'm looking forward to continuing my friendship and partnership with Sachit. So stay tuned for some good things to come. Thanks again to this week's sponsor, Focusrite, and the wonderful line of the Scarlett 2i2 3G sound cards. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil. Podcast production and marketing by fullcast.co. As always, you can support the show and everything we do through your patronage using the link in the show notes, which will redirect you to glow.fm. Astute listeners will be aware that last week I teased out an episode with Chavi Sakdev, and that's actually going to be next week's episode. So I had to do a little bit of episode rotation. Still excited to bring that amazing episode to you. She is the second podcaster ever in India, and we get a really in-depth peek at what's happening inside the world of podcasting in India. If you made it this far, you're no doubt looking for the retention hashtag, and I will not disappoint. Let's go with Creator Sachit. So it's the word creator and Sachit, S-A-C-H-I-T. And let us know that you are a true podcast junkie. As always, thank you for everything you do to support the show. I'm always indebted to you, my listener, because I appreciate, with all the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of podcasts in the Apple Podcast ecosystem, the fact that you take the time to listen to this one is something that I don't take for granted, and I don't take lightly. So love you, each one of you listening. Have a fantastic week.